Shortly after dawn, on Monday, June 5, 1967, Israeli aircraft took off from their bases. Their mission was to destroy the Egyptian Air Force in Sinai and the Suez Canal zone. Their attacks marked the beginning of the Six-Day War, the third major Arab-Israeli conflict in the Middle East since World War II. An Israeli ground offensive followed the air assaults, which drove into Egyptian-occupied Sinai. A swift Israeli victory would consolidate its sovereign status in its ancient homeland. But defeat would almost certainly guarantee its destruction and upset the delicate balance of superpower rivalry in the Middle East. The Israeli attack was a huge gamble against the massive Arab armed forces. Israeli General Moshe Dayan and Egyptian Field Marshal Mohammed Abdel Hakim Amer would decide the future of the Middle East in a dramatic clash of warriors. Since 1945, the Middle East has seen more conflict and turbulence than any other part of the world. Tension has been caused by regional conflicts between the Arabs and Israelis, and also through the Middle East's strategic geographical position. It lies at the crossroads between Europe, Asia, and Africa. Furthermore, the discovery of oil in the Middle East at the beginning of the 20th century has added to the region's global importance. In March 1945, Egypt, together with Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen, formed the Arab League. Its aim was to foster Arab unity and reduce Western influence over the Middle East. The League soon became concerned with the influx of Jewish refugees, many of them survivors of Hitler's Holocaust, into the British Mandate of Palestine. The Jews were determined to establish an independent state in their biblical homeland. In May 1948, immediately after the British Mandate ended, the Jews declared the independent state of Israel. 30,000 Arab League troops invaded the new country, but the Israelis were able to repel them. The Israelis forced Egypt to sign an armistice on the Greek island of Rhodes in February 1949. The other Arab League states soon followed suit. Hostile Arab countries surrounded Israel. They refused to recognize the new state and were determined to destroy it. Throughout the next few years, tension in the Middle East remained high, with continual clashes on Israel's borders. In 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. With one stroke, the magnitude of the Middle East during the Cold War was brought to a head, especially since the Soviet Union supported Egypt. Great Britain and France, the canal's principal shareholders, feared that Egypt might monopolize this vital waterway. They decided to reclaim it by force. On October 29, 1956, the Israelis, cohorts of the British and French, suddenly invaded Egyptian Sinai in order to preempt a feared Arab attack. The Egyptians were caught completely by surprise and were overwhelmed. British and French landings in Egypt's canal zone followed. By the end of the first week in November, Egypt was facing catastrophic defeat. But the UN, with strong American and Soviet support, stepped in and quickly imposed a ceasefire. The British, French, and Israeli forces eventually withdrew from the Canal Zone and Sinai and were replaced by UN peacekeeping troops. Nasser's stand against the Anglo-French and Israeli coalition gained worldwide sympathy. Seen as a champion of the Arab world, he renewed his quest to destroy Israel. In 1958, he strengthened the Arab League by forming the United Arab Republic with Syria. Violence on Israel's borders increased. Egypt and other Arab countries were openly receiving armaments and diplomatic support from the communist bloc. The Suez Canal remained closed to Israeli ships, and Egyptian artillery blocked the Gulf of Aqaba, Israel's only access to the Red Sea. On Israel's northern border, the Syrians used the dominant Golan Heights to bombard settlements. The frontier with Jordan witnessed increasing violence by displaced Palestinian Arabs who had been condemned to living in refugee camps. Only in Sinai, where UN peacekeepers continued to operate, was the situation relatively calm. By 1967, tension mounted along Israel's borders as terrorism escalated. Another major war in the Middle East appeared inevitable. The responsibility for waging it would rest on the shoulders of Israeli General Moshe Dayan and Egyptian Field Marshal Mohammed Amer. Moshe Dayan was born in May 1915 at Degania, near the Sea of Galilee, on the first Jewish kibbutz in Palestine. Life was tough on the kibbutz, but it developed Dayan's determination and independent spirit. As a young man, Dayan helped form the Haganah, an illegal Zionist military force in what was then British-occupied Palestine. In the late 1930s, Dayan became one of the leaders of the Special Night Squads, which were formed to combat Palestinian Arab violence against the Jews during their revolt against increased Jewish immigration. Ironically, his boss was a British Army captain, Ord Wingate, who taught him about guerrilla warfare. Wingate would later lead a special force, the Chindits, deep behind Japanese lines in Burma during World War II. The Special Night Squads proved highly effective, and Dayan's reputation as a military leader grew. However, his membership in Haganah led to his arrest and imprisonment in 1939, when the British declared it an illegal organization. 2 years later, the British agreed that Jews could fight against the Axis powers in the Middle East. They formed the Jewish Brigade, and Dayan was released from prison to join it. In June 1941, the British invaded Vichy French Syria. The Jewish Brigade took part, but Dayan was seriously wounded and lost an eye. The black patch he wore thereafter became a distinguishing trademark. Dayan led a commando battalion and was in charge of Jerusalem during the War for Independence in 1948. While serving as the Chief of Staff of the Israeli Defense Force, he planned and led the 100 hours advance across the Sinai to the Suez Canal, which crushed the Egyptian army during the 1956 Arab-Israeli War. Two years later, Dayan retired from military life and joined the Israeli Labor Party, the Mapai. The following spring, he became a member of the government under David Ben-Gurion, a founding father of Israel. Dayan resigned 5 years later, but in 1965, he joined Ben-Gurion to form the Alliance of Israeli Workers' Party, or Rafi, and was re-elected to the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. In 1967, as tension between Israel and its Arab neighbors reached new heights, Moshe Dayan was appointed defense minister. It was to be the greatest challenge of his life. Mohammed Abdel Hakim Amer was born in Egypt in 1919, the son of a colonel who had served alongside British troops in the Sudan in the 1890s. He was destined for a military career and graduated from the Cairo Military Academy in 1939. Amer was an outstanding young officer and was quickly promoted during the early 1940s. In 1945, he was promoted to colonel and served on the general staff during the 1948 Arab-Israeli conflict. Amer was a key figure during the 1952 Free Officers' Revolution in Egypt, led by General Mohammed Naguib, which deposed King Farouk and eventually brought Gamal Abdel Nasser to power. In August 1954, with Nasser's friendship and support, he was promoted to full general and appointed defense minister, as well as commander-in-chief of the Egyptian Armed Forces. Amer was given a free rein to modernize the Egyptian armed forces. This he did with great enthusiasm, negotiating and procuring armaments from Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union. His diplomatic skills became even more important when Egypt grew closer to the communist bloc after its relations with the West cooled. He also developed a good understanding of Soviet military doctrine. Following the establishment of the United Arab Republic of Egypt and Syria in 1958, Amer presided over Syria as Nasser's pro-consul. Promoted to field marshal in 1960, he relinquished his defense minister post 2 years later, but remained commander-in-chief of the Egyptian armed forces. Between 1962 and 1967, Amer directed the disastrous Egyptian intervention in the Yemen civil war, but his standing remained high in Nasser's eyes. In the early months of 1967, Amer was ordered to plan for a more important task, the destruction of the State of Israel. Field Marshal Amer and General Dayan were now faced with the grim prospect of another war in the Middle East. In 1964, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO, was formed following an Arab Summit conference held in Cairo. This led to a dramatic increase in tension in the Middle East, as the PLO vowed to destroy Israel and reclaim its historic birthright in Palestine. In May 1967, Egypt deployed its army on the frontier with Israel, claiming that Israel was about to take reprisals against Syria. The UN left when it was asked to remove its 3,000-man peacekeeping force from the Sinai. On May 17th, to show their strength, Amer's forces paraded for Nasser and Cairo before they began their move on the Sinai. By the 20th, there were over 100,000 Egyptian troops and more than 1,000 tanks facing the Israeli border. 2 days later, Nasser closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli ships, blocking its access to the Red Sea. In the same month, King Hussein of Jordan was pressured into joining the alliance between Egypt and Syria. Jordan then placed its forces under Amer's overall command, deploying the bulk of them to the west bank of the River Jordan. Iraq also joined the Arab alliance, offering to deploy some 10,000 men and 200 tanks. Syrian forces had already engaged in a long battle with Israeli troops across the Israeli border. They too were now increasing their forces. The formidable Golan Heights also gave the Syrians a major advantage over the Israelis. Dayan and the Israeli government watched these developments with growing apprehension. By the end of May, the situation had become critical. Egypt's hostility toward Israel threatened the very existence of the Jewish state. War appeared inevitable, and the odds were very much in Arab favor. In total, the Arab states had almost 500,000 troops, over 3,000 armored vehicles, and over 800 frontline bomber and fighter aircraft poised against Israel at the beginning of June 1967. The Egyptian army was installed in the Sinai by the beginning of June. Leading the Arab forces, they were now ready to sweep the Israelis away in a decisive offensive. Amer also believed that the combined Arab air forces with their large number of modern Soviet-built aircraft would swamp Israel's air force. Amer was convinced that he could attack Israel and strike a fatal blow before Dayan's Israeli Defense Force could react. Once Egypt began the offensive, he planned to order the Syrian, Jordanian, and Iraqi armies to attack simultaneously so that Israel would be squeezed out of existence. All Amer needed was a little more time to put the final pieces of his plan in place. When he was appointed as defense minister, Moshe Dayan had inherited an Israeli force of 100,000 troops, 1,000 tanks, and less than 400 aircraft. The Arabs outnumbered him by almost 5 to 1 in manpower, 3 to 1 in armor, and 2 to 1 in the air. Dayan's chief of staff, Yitzhak Rabin, drew up the Israeli defense plan. It acknowledged that surprise and speed were vital to any Israeli success. The only way this could be achieved was for Dayan to strike first. Unwittingly, Amer aided Dayan's planning. Nasser's bravado, public mobilization, and deployment of the Egyptian forces gave Dayan ample warning. Dayan and Rabin decided that their initial target must be the Arab air forces. If the Israelis could neutralize their opponent's air power at the outset, the Arab ground forces would be seriously handicapped. Since Egypt posed the largest threat with their strong armed forces, Dayan decided that they must be the initial target. The airstrikes would be followed immediately by a ground assault into Sinai to catch Amer's troops off balance. Under the codename Moked, the Israeli Air Force, led by Major General Mordecai Had, would carry out simultaneous attacks against all Egyptian air bases in Sinai and the Suez Canal zone. The attack was fixed for 7:45 a.m. on Monday, June 5, 1967. Israeli intelligence had confirmed the Egyptian air crews and ground staff on the air bases would be at breakfast, and those living off base would be en route from their homes. Dayan hoped to catch all the Egyptian aircraft on the ground. The Israeli planes attacking bases in Sinai and southern Egypt would fly a direct route. But those striking airfields elsewhere would fly out into the Mediterranean and approach from the northwest to achieve total surprise. Once the Egyptian air bases had been neutralized, the Israeli Air Force would turn, if needed, on Jordan and Syria. Dayan had every confidence in his highly trained pilots and their aircraft, which included the modern French-built Mirage and Mystère. Once the air assault succeeded, Dayan would unleash his armored formations on Amer's ground forces with similar speed and ferocity. Their main objective was to penetrate the Egyptian defenses in eastern Sinai and then advance rapidly to the Suez Canal, as in 1956. Using a combination of attacks from the air and on the ground, he expected to hit Amer's armed forces in the open, and with such speed and firepower that the Egyptians would be crushed before they could respond. If Jordan and Syria joined in the conflict, Dayan's intention was to drive the Jordanians out of the West Bank region and also to seize the Arab half of Jerusalem. In the extreme north, his aim was to capture the Golan Heights from Syria, though he had hoped he could do both after he had first dealt with Egypt. Above all, Dayan realized that the preemptive airstrike had to succeed. If it did not, Israel's very survival would be in jeopardy. The Israeli Defense Force, or IDF, was young but highly motivated. They knew that their country's continued survival as an independent state depended on them. Once soldiers had completed their time on active duty, they were obliged to remain in the reserve, which was retrained annually and could be mobilized very quickly in time of national emergency. Because of Israel's small population and the constant threat to its borders, the IDF was a genuine citizen army and had a high number of women in its ranks. Though not employed in frontline roles, they had vital support tasks as medical, intelligence, and headquarters staff. This enabled the maximum number of male soldiers to fight in the front line. Dayan's troops were well trained by a corps of regular officers and non-coms who were veterans of the 1948 and 1956 wars. All new recruits were filled with the spirit that had enabled Israel to achieve victory in these two conflicts. In 1967, although it was establishing its own armaments industry, Israel's military equipment was largely imported. The IDF placed great emphasis on armored warfare. The backbone of the tank force was the British-built Centurion, with its thick armor and powerful 105-millimeter gun. Israeli mechanized infantry used the American World War II vintage white half-track. Dayan's artillery was also Western in origin and included self-propelled guns for use with his armored formations. But in 1967, the men and women of the IDF also took comfort in having the legendary Moshe Dayan at their head. The overriding motivation of Amer's Egyptian forces among the Arabs facing Israel was to avenge their country's military humiliation at Suez in 1956. With increased backing from the Soviet Union, Egypt's leaders grew more confident and assured in assessing Israel's weaknesses. By 1967, they felt they could finally crush Israel. Like the Israeli Defense Force, the Egyptian armed forces were all recruited, but soldier for soldier, they were generally inferior in technical education. Largely thanks to Amer, the Egyptian army was well equipped with Warsaw Pact weapons. The tank forces had the Soviet-designed T-55 and T-62, which were robust and simple to operate. The Egyptians were also confident that their Soviet surface-to-air missile systems would help keep the Israeli Air Force at bay. Both Syria and Iraq were trained and equipped much like the Egyptians. The Arab forces were trained largely along Soviet lines, but tactics were often misunderstood, and they lacked initiative. The exception was the Jordanian armed forces, considered a more professional and capable force than those of Egypt, Syria, or Iraq. The Jordanian troops were intensely loyal to their king. They were tough fighters and respected by the Israelis. But while King Hussein wanted to stay out of the conflict, his soldiers would obey him if he were forced to enter the fray. Amer and Nasser had instilled a belief in their troops that they could defeat Israel, but they recognized that early victories were needed to ensure that the remainder of the Arab coalition played their full part. On the evening of June 4th, 1967, Israeli troops made their final preparations for launching their assault on Egypt. They prayed for victory in the days to come. For Moshe Dayan and Abdel Hakim Amer, it was to be a life or death contest. Shortly after dawn on June 5th, 1967, Israeli air crews raced to their aircraft. Their target, the Egyptian airfields in Sinai and the Canal Zone. The first wave of Israeli fighters and bombers took off. They fanned out over the Sinai and the Mediterranean, hoping to strike their targets from behind. To avoid radar detection, the Israeli planes entered Egyptian airspace at altitudes as low as 50 feet. The first wave of Dayan's attack aircraft struck as planned precisely at 7:45 a.m., just as the Egyptian pilots were enjoying breakfast and their aircraft were all still on the ground. To Dayan's relief, surprise was complete. Over the next 3 hours, a non-stop series of raids were flown against Amer's fighter and bomber airfields. Some Egyptian fighters did manage to avoid Israeli attention on the ground and scrambled to meet the threat. But once in the air, the Egyptian aircraft were no match for Dayan's air crews, and they were shot out of the sky. It was a short, sharp, and devastatingly one-sided battle. The Israeli assault had virtually annihilated Amer's Egyptian Air Force and destroyed airfields as far as Cairo and Luxor. Over 300 Egyptian planes, including fighters, bombers, and helicopters, had been wiped out. Victorious, the Israeli planes returned to their bases to rearm and refuel in preparation for similar strikes on Egypt's allies. By midday on day one of the war, Dayan had established total air supremacy over Sinai and was ready to release his ground forces. But Amer, not yet fully aware of the disaster that had befallen his air force, had also ordered his armor to attack eastwards from Sinai and was hoping to strike a decisive blow against Dayan's troops. The Egyptians had a powerful force of 7 divisions with over 100,000 men, 1,000 tanks, and hundreds of artillery pieces. The Israeli Southern Command, led by Major General Yeshayahu Gavish, had 3 armored divisions with Centurion tanks, paratroops, mechanized infantry, and self-propelled artillery. Dayan had already achieved the necessary surprise against Amer with the Israeli airstrikes. Now it was the IDF division's turn to keep the Egyptian forces off balance with the speed of their ground offensive. The Israelis advanced on 3 routes across the Sinai with an armored division on each axis. The northern thrust, led by Major General Israel Tal, was held up at first by some determined fighting by Egyptian troops along the Sinai border. But by the beginning of the second day of the war, they overcame the resistance, and Tal's armor was racing toward the Suez Canal across the northern strip of the Sinai. In the center, Major General Avraham Yafi's division penetrated through Wadi Harudin, an expanse of sand dunes considered by Amer and his commanders to be impassable. Dayan had given Yafi the mission of attacking any back doors to cut off the main supply routes to the Egyptian front. When his armor emerged from the sand dunes and fell on the hapless Egyptians, the battle was over almost before it began. Taken completely by surprise, the Egyptian units were swiftly annihilated. By the first evening of the conflict, Yafi's division had captured a vital junction and cut off Amer's armies in eastern Sinai. It had also blocked any chance of Egyptian reinforcements from reaching their weary comrades who were struggling to prevent an Israeli breakthrough. Hundreds of remaining Egyptians surrendered. In the south, Dayan had assigned the toughest task to the division commanded by Major General Ariel Sharon. It faced the strongest and best organized of the Egyptian defenses along the eastern Sinai front. As Amer's troops prepared to meet him, Sharon decided to overcome the problem of facing a firmly entrenched enemy with speed, flexibility, and concentrated firepower. Combined forces of armor, infantry, paratroopers, artillery, and engineers attacked Amer's defenders from the flanks and the rear, cutting off the main Egyptian defensive positions from any possible reinforcement. But the battles to achieve a breakthrough were to continue for 3 more days. Nevertheless, by the end of the first day, Dayan's IDF had gained the initiative with surprise, speed, and decisive action against Amer's forces on the Sinai front. Amer, however, refused to acknowledge that his air force had been largely destroyed and that things were going badly in Sinai. Instead, he claimed success and predicted the imminent destruction of Dayan's forces both in the air and on the ground. Hearing Amer's boast, Nasser told the other Arab countries that the time was ripe to attack Israel. Despite the Israeli success against Egypt, Nasser's false optimism was to give Dayan a potential headache. If Syria, Jordan, and Iraq were to attack, the Israeli forces would be very thinly spread and in real danger of being overwhelmed. As the first disastrous days of the 1967 Arab-Israeli War unfolded for Egypt, Amer was determined to rally by widening the conflict. King Hussein of Jordan, uplifted by Amer's wildly optimistic reports of Egyptian success, decided to launch his own armed forces against Israel. With the Syrians and Iraqis, he sent his air force to attack targets in Israel. Dayan's response was swift, ruthless, and decisive. Within hours, all three air forces had suffered the fate of their Egyptian counterparts and were crippled by the end of the day. Starting with the town of Jenin in the north, Dayan's ground attacks then broke into the West Bank area on the 6th of June. Jordanian troops were soon surrounded and forced to surrender. Israeli troops also closed in on the holy city of Jerusalem. The Jordanian 27th Infantry Brigade held the Arab part of the city. It was opposed by Colonel Mordecai Gur's 55th Parachute Brigade. The battle for Jerusalem began on the morning of June 6th. Intense fighting would continue for 3 days. Casualties were heavy on both sides. But the Jordanian defenders were eventually overwhelmed and forced to surrender. The Arab half of the old city had fallen where the ancient Jewish Wailing Wall stood. The Israeli troops were triumphant but exhausted after days of fighting. They exchanged their weapons for skull caps and prayer shawls and praised God for their victory. An emotional Moshe Dayan soon joined his soldiers at the Wailing Wall. Meanwhile, in the Sinai, Dayan's 3 armored divisions had broken through the Egyptian defenses and were racing toward the Suez Canal. Confused by conflicting orders from Amer and shocked by the intensity of the Israeli assault, panic set in among the Egyptian defenders. Rather than stand and fight, senior Egyptian officers deserted, along with most of their troops. Amer's defenses were quickly crumbling. Determined Israeli armored support pressed on through destroyed or abandoned Egyptian obstacles toward their objectives. In desperation, Amer ordered reserves to counter the Israeli advance, but Dayan's men caught them out in the open. As the Egyptian armored units attempted to link up with the front line, they were systematically cut down. By June 9th, it was all over on the Sinai front. The Egyptian army had been trapped and then ruthlessly smashed by the 3 Israeli armored divisions. Sinai was now in Israel's hands. Amer's depleted forces had been thrown back across the Suez Canal. Thousands of Egyptian troops did not make it. Meanwhile, on the northern front, Dayan's forces were faced with the challenge of forcing the Syrians off the Golan Heights. But they too had no answer to the resolute Israeli assaults, and Dayan's men captured their objectives. The most spectacular operation was the assault on the key to the Golan defenses, Mount Hermon. In spite of heavy Syrian fire, the helicopters managed to land close to the summit. And the Syrians were soon forced to surrender. In the east, the Jordanians were forced to abandon all their territory west of the River Jordan. The Arabs had had enough, and the UN was able to step in and quickly broker a ceasefire. The Six-Day War was over. Israel gained the Sinai, the west bank of the River Jordan, the Golan Heights, and Jerusalem. But unlike 1956, it would retain all the captured territory. Egyptian casualties alone had been high, with over 15,000 dead or wounded, and a further 6,000, including 500 officers, taken prisoner. Over 500 tanks were captured, and 80% of Egypt's weapons and equipment was lost. In contrast, the Israeli casualties on all three fronts were less than 1,500. Moshe Dayan was once again a national hero after the Six-Day War and remained Minister of Defense for the next 3 years. But in 1970, his aggressive policy toward Egypt caused controversy, as it did not bring about peace and merely served to increase Soviet influence in Egypt. Dayan became defense minister again in 1973, but was foiled by an Egyptian attack, which opened the Yom Kippur War that October. He resigned the following year. In 1977, he became Israeli foreign minister and was a key broker of the Camp David peace accord with Egypt, which was ratified in March 1979. After a brief retirement, Dayan died in 1981. He is still regarded today as one of Israel's greatest heroes and the personification of its struggle. Amer was a broken man as a result of Egypt's humiliating defeat. He had lost his nerve at the beginning of the conflict with disastrous consequences. He was dismissed from his post by President Nasser and was set to undergo a public trial for his failure. But Amer committed suicide in 1968 before facing the tribunal. The Six-Day War in June 1967 was a stunning Israeli victory, which impressed the world. But there was to be no political settlement, and once again, the Arab military humiliation led to a burning desire for revenge. It all boiled over in 1973 with border clashes and terrorism. Though tension remains high in the region to this day, the Six-Day War was one of the most decisive military campaigns of the post-1945 world. For Moshe Dayan, the 1967 war had been an unquestionable triumph. But for Abdel Hakim Amer, it had been a humiliating and ultimately fatal clash of warriors.